There are moments in a person's life that arrive quietly, without warning, yet change everything forever. They do not come with noise or ceremony. They come like the closing of a door in a dark room. You hear it, you feel it deep in your chest, and before you even turn around, you know something has ended. For Charlotte Fairley, that moment came on a cold Thursday morning in late October. The first frost had settled along the edges of the tall windows at Ashfield Manor. The pale morning light entered the study with a dull gray glow, touching the worn furniture and the large wooden desk where Charlotte sat with a ledger open before her. She had been working quietly for nearly an hour, carefully studying the estate accounts. It was not work she enjoyed, but it was work that had become necessary. Since her father's illness 2 years earlier, the responsibility for Ashfield had slowly fallen to her. The fire in the study burned low. Charlotte had begun conserving wood months ago, though she never mentioned it aloud to anyone. Across the room stood Thomas Bennett. He had served the Fairley family for more than 30 years. Charlotte had known him since childhood. He had always been steady and dependable, a man who never hesitated when delivering even the most unpleasant news. But this morning was different. Thomas stood in the doorway with his hat pressed between his hands. 10 full seconds passed before he spoke. Charlotte noticed. She looked up slowly from the ledger, already feeling a strange cold settle beneath her ribs. "Miss Charlotte," he said quietly. The softness in his voice told her everything before the words came. She placed her pen down on the desk and waited. "There is something you must know," Thomas continued. "Something I should have told you sooner." Charlotte did not interrupt. She simply watched him with calm patience. "The debts of Ashfield Estate," he said carefully, "have been purchased." Charlotte's eyes did not move. "Purchased?" she asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "Over the past 18 months," he continued, choosing each word with care, "every one of the estate's debts has been acquired by the office of Duke Julian Montgomery, the 3rd Duke of Radcliffe." The room became very quiet. Charlotte looked down at the open ledger on her desk. For nearly 2 years, she had worked to reduce the estate's debts. She had believed they were still held by the small lenders in the nearby towns. She had believed time was on her side, but now she understood something else. Someone had been waiting. Someone patient. Someone powerful. The Duke of Radcliffe had quietly purchased every debt tied to Ashfield without informing her. Charlotte folded her hands over the ledger and listened to the faint sound of coughing from upstairs. Her father's cough had become a constant presence in the house during the past 2 winters. "How long?" she asked calmly. Thomas understood. 3 weeks, Miss Charlotte," he replied. "Perhaps 4 before the matter is presented, before the county court in Harwick." Charlotte nodded slowly. She studied the numbers on the page again. They looked different now. Clearer. More unforgiving. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she closed the ledger. "Then we will go to Harwick first." Thomas blinked in surprise. "Miss?" "If the Duke intends to claim the estate through the court," Charlotte said steadily, "then I will appear there as the representative of Ashfield." Thomas stared at her. Charlotte continued calmly. "I possess the original deed from 1748. I have my grandfather's records, and I have every payment agreement signed by my father." She looked directly at Thomas. "Those payments were made regularly, were they not?" "They were," he said quietly. "Every quarter." "Then we have a case." Charlotte rose from the desk and walked to the tall window overlooking the fields of Ashfield. The frost covered the grass in a thin silver layer. The sky hung low and pale above the quiet land that had belonged to her family for generations. "I would rather lose fighting," she said softly, "than lose in silence." Thomas watched her carefully. "Your father would say the same thing," he murmured. Charlotte turned back toward him. "My father would have said it 30 years ago," she replied gently. "But he is too ill to say it now." Her voice became firm again. "So I will say it for him." They left for Harwick the following Monday. Word spread quickly through the small village of Ashfield Cross. Everyone heard that Charlotte Fairley intended to challenge the Duke of Radcliffe in court. Many people thought her brave. Others thought her foolish. But Charlotte paid no attention to the whispers. During the weekend, she reviewed every document in her father's study. She examined every contract, every payment record, every letter written between the estate and its creditors. She wrote to the family solicitor, Mr. Fenn, informing him that she would appear personally at the hearing. His reply arrived the next afternoon. It politely suggested she reconsider. Charlotte wrote back, confirming her arrival. Before leaving, she visited her father. Edward Fairley lay resting in bed, thin from illness, but still sharp in mind and spirit. When Charlotte explained the situation, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he remained silent for a long time. "Montgomery," he said finally. "Yes," Edward sighed. His father was the same kind of man, he said quietly. Patient, methodical. He turned his head toward her. "You understand what you are walking into?" Charlotte nodded. "I understand that someone must defend this place." Edward studied her face carefully. Then he reached out and briefly took her hand. "Be careful," he said softly. "Not of him. He will be polite in public." Charlotte waited. "Be careful," he continued, "of the sympathy of strangers." She squeezed his hand. Then she left for Harwick. The county court stood beside the market square, an old stone building that had settled many disputes over many years. Charlotte arrived early on the morning of the hearing. The courtroom was already filling with curious observers. She sat at the claimant's table beside Mr. Fenn and arranged her documents carefully. When the doors at the back of the room opened, the entire court turned to look. Duke Julian Montgomery entered. Charlotte looked up, and for the first time, the woman who had come to fight for her family's land met the man who held its future in his hands. The courtroom remained quiet after Charlotte finished speaking. For 3 minutes, she had explained the history of Ashfield. She had spoken clearly about the payments her family had made, about the absence of any official declaration of default, and about the long relationship between the Fairley estate and the Montgomery holdings. When she placed the old 1814 letter on the table before the magistrate, she did it calmly. There was no drama in the motion. It was simply another piece of truth added to the room. Then she sat down. Thomas Bennet, seated beside her, released a breath he had been holding. Across the room, the Duke's solicitor stood to respond. He spoke with confidence. His voice carried easily through the courtroom as he explained the legal position of the Duke of Radcliffe. The debts had been purchased legally. Ownership of those debts transferred every right previously held by the original creditors. According to the terms of the agreements, default could now be declared. His argument was organized and persuasive. Charlotte listened carefully. She knew he was good. She had expected nothing less from a man representing one of the most powerful estates in the region. The magistrate leaned forward slightly as the solicitor finished. The room seemed to settle into the quiet expectation that the matter was nearly decided. Then something unexpected happened. Duke Julian Montgomery rose from his seat. A faint ripple moved through the room. It was unusual for the principal party to speak directly during a preliminary hearing. Normally, everything passed through the solicitors. Even the Duke's own lawyer looked momentarily surprised. But Julian Montgomery stepped forward calmly. He stood straight, one hand resting lightly on the table before him. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the magistrate, "my solicitor has explained the legal position correctly." The magistrate nodded. The Duke paused for a brief moment before continuing. "However," he said, "I do not wish to pursue the claim at this time." The words settled over the courtroom like sudden still air. Charlotte felt it immediately. Every person in the room had heard it. The Duke continued calmly. "The Fairley estate has maintained its obligations in good faith during a period of clear financial hardship. Payments were made consistently, though reduced in amount." He spoke with the same steady tone he had used since entering the room. "For that reason, I am prepared to extend the repayment period for the estate's debts by 18 months under revised terms. These terms may be arranged between the respective solicitors without prejudice to either party's legal standing." No one spoke. The magistrate blinked once, clearly not expecting this turn. The Duke's solicitor looked as though someone had quietly moved a piece in the middle of a chess game he believed already finished. The observers sitting along the wooden benches watched in absolute silence. Charlotte did not move. She sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table before her. What she felt was not relief. Relief would come later. What she felt instead was suspicion. Powerful men rarely changed direction without reason. She lifted her eyes and looked directly at him. At that moment, the Duke turned slightly from the magistrate and met her gaze. It lasted only a second, but in that second, Charlotte saw something unexpected in his expression. Recognition. Interest. The look of a man who had discovered something he had not predicted. The magistrate cleared his throat and called a short adjournment so the revised terms could be discussed. The courtroom slowly began to move again. People whispered quietly to each other. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor. Charlotte collected her documents carefully and stood. She did not approach the Duke. She walked out of the courtroom into the cold October air. Outside the courthouse, the sky was bright and sharp with autumn light. The market square of Harwick carried on with its ordinary business, as if nothing unusual had occurred inside the stone building behind her. Thomas followed a few steps behind. "Miss Charlotte," he said carefully. "Yes. We still have the estate." "For now," she replied. She turned slightly toward the courthouse doors. "And we must understand why." That afternoon, she returned to the inn with Mr. Fenn. They spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the Duke's proposal. The revised terms were clear. The repayment period would extend 18 months beyond the original schedule. The monthly payments would be adjusted to reflect the estate's current income rather than the old agreements. No penalties would be imposed for the reduced payments already made. Mr. Fenn adjusted his spectacles while studying the document. "It is very reasonable," he admitted reluctantly. Charlotte stood beside the window overlooking the market square. "Yes," she said quietly. "That is precisely what concerns me." Mr. Fenn glanced up. "You believe there is another motive?" Charlotte did not answer immediately. She thought about the courtroom, about the moment when the Duke had stood, about the brief silence between them when their eyes met. "He had been watching," she said slowly. Mr. Fenn frowned. "Watching what?" "Me." The solicitor shifted in his chair, clearly unsure how to respond. Charlotte turned back to the table. "He made the decision after I spoke. That may simply be coincidence." Charlotte shook her head. "No." That evening, she wrote a long letter to her father, explaining everything that had happened. She described the hearing. She described the Duke's sudden decision. But even as she wrote the words, she found herself returning to a single thought. Why had he done it? Late that night, Charlotte sat beside the small window of her room at the inn. The town had grown quiet. Only the distant sound of horses on cobblestones occasionally disturbed the silence. She rested her hands in her lap and allowed her thoughts to move slowly through the events of the day. Julian Montgomery had spent 18 months quietly purchasing the debts of Ashfield. That required planning, patience, intent. A man who invested that much time into a strategy did not abandon it casually, which meant the change had happened inside that courtroom. After she spoke, Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered the exact look on his face when he entered the room. Not arrogance, not indifference, something far more complicated. The expression of a man observing something carefully. The next morning she left Harwick and returned to Ashfield Manor. The familiar fields stretched pale and quiet under the fading autumn sky. When the carriage rolled through the old stone gates, Charlotte felt the weight of the house again. The silence that had lived there during the past 2 difficult years had not completely lifted. But something had changed. She stepped down from the carriage and walked inside. Mrs. Doyle met her in the entrance hall. "Your father is awake," the housekeeper said gently. "He has been waiting." Charlotte went upstairs immediately. Edward Fairley was sitting upright in bed, wrapped in blankets but alert. He studied her face as she entered. "Well," he said. Charlotte pulled a chair beside the bed and told him everything. She spoke about the documents, about the arguments in court, and about the Duke. When she finished, Edward remained quiet for a long moment. 18 months, he said thoughtfully. "Yes." He leaned his head slightly against the pillow. "That is not the action of a man who has lost interest in the land." Charlotte nodded. "I know." Edward looked toward the window where the fading afternoon light touched the floor. "Be watchful," he said quietly. Charlotte stood and walked to the window. Outside, the bare trees of autumn moved gently in the wind across the Ashfield fields. "I intend to be," she replied. 3 days later, a letter arrived bearing the seal of Radcliffe, and when Charlotte opened it, she discovered that Duke Julian Montgomery intended to visit Ashfield Manor in person. 3 days after Charlotte returned from Harwick, the letter arrived. Doyle carried it into the sitting room with the careful expression of a woman who had already noticed the seal and chosen not to comment on it. "It is from Radcliffe, Miss Charlotte," she said simply. Charlotte accepted the envelope. The Montgomery seal pressed into the wax was unmistakable. She opened the letter slowly. The handwriting inside was precise and steady. Duke Julian Montgomery wrote that the revised legal terms would soon be finalized between the solicitors. However, he wished to visit Ashfield Manor the following Friday afternoon to ensure any remaining questions regarding the agreement were addressed. He added a final line, "if it was not inconvenient." Charlotte read the sentence twice. It was written like a polite request, yet it clearly assumed he would come. She set the letter on the desk. Declining the visit was possible, but Charlotte knew she would not decline. Not because she felt gratitude, because she wanted answers. Friday arrived with clear, cold air and pale winter light spreading across the fields of Ashfield. Charlotte spent the morning reviewing account books and speaking with Graves, one of the estate's longest-serving tenants. The revised payment plan meant the estate could survive, but only with careful management. When the sound of horses reached the front drive, Charlotte remained seated in the sitting room. She would not rush to the window. Mrs. Doyle appeared moments later. "The Duke of Radcliffe has arrived." Charlotte rose calmly. Julian Montgomery entered the room a moment later. He looked exactly as she remembered him from the courtroom. Tall, composed, observant. He wore a dark coat suitable for travel. His posture relaxed but controlled. His eyes briefly studied the room before settling on Charlotte. "Miss Fairley," he said. "Your Grace," she replied politely. They sat across from one another at the small tea table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people measuring each other carefully. "I wish to ensure the agreement between our estates is fully understood," the Duke said at last. That is sensible, Charlotte answered. He explained the revised payment terms clearly. The debt would remain under his office during the agreement. Payments would be reduced, but regular. If the estate met those terms, the claim against Ashfield would remain suspended. Charlotte listened closely. When he finished, she folded her hands. That is more than fair, she said. It is fair, he replied. Charlotte watched him steadily. Then she asked the question that had waited since the courtroom. Why? He did not pretend to misunderstand. That is a reasonable question, he said. Charlotte waited. The estate has been maintained well, he continued. Despite hardship, the land is productive. The tenants remain loyal. Few families would have preserved it as carefully under similar circumstances. He paused briefly. Acquiring land through the collapse of a family that has acted in good faith is not something I admire. Charlotte studied his face. His answer was direct, not theatrical, not apologetic, simply honest. My father will wish to thank you, she said. There is no need. There is, Charlotte replied calmly. He will insist. The Duke inclined his head slightly. I would be glad to meet him. Charlotte stood. Then please follow me. They walked upstairs together. Edward Fairley received the Duke with the composed dignity of a man determined not to appear weak before a visitor. Charlotte sat quietly near the window while the two men spoke. They discussed the agreement first. Then the conversation shifted. The Duke remarked on Charlotte's understanding of estate law. Edward answered with quiet pride that his daughter had never waited for permission to be capable. The Duke seemed to consider that statement carefully. Charlotte noticed something then. Her father was studying Julian Montgomery the same way she had studied him in the courtroom. Measuring. Revising. When the Duke left later that afternoon, Charlotte stood at the window listening to the sound of his horse fading along the drive. Her father's voice came softly from behind her. He listens, when Charlotte turned. That is rare. Yes, Edward said quietly. Over the following weeks, life at Ashfield returned to its usual rhythm. The revised agreement was signed in January. The estate accounts were reorganized. Plans for the coming spring planting began. Julian Montgomery visited occasionally. Each visit revealed something new about him. He was not a man who spoke unnecessarily, but when he did speak, his words carried careful thought. He asked questions about farming methods, water use, and land management with genuine interest. He listened when Charlotte disagreed with him, and she often did. Their conversations became long and thoughtful. Slowly, the sharp edge of suspicion between them softened into something else. Respect. One January morning, another letter arrived. Charlotte opened it at her writing desk. This letter was different. Julian Montgomery wrote that he found himself in unfamiliar territory. He was a man accustomed to certainty in business and decisions. Yet the more he spoke with her, the less certain he became about keeping their relationship within the boundaries of simple estate business. He asked permission to call again. Not on business, simply to call. Charlotte read the letter twice. Then she answered yes. When he arrived the following Saturday, winter sunlight filled the sitting room. They spoke quietly about her father's health first. Then the Duke said something unexpected. I should tell you something honestly, before anything becomes more complicated. Charlotte looked at him. Then tell me. He explained that he had first noticed her months before the courtroom, at a county meeting. She had been the only person in the room who had carefully read a survey report about water diversion. She had calmly explained its flaws to a local official, while others listened. I remembered that, he said. And when the debts of Ashfield became available, I cannot say my decision was entirely practical. Charlotte absorbed this quietly. You watched from a distance, she said. Yes. That is not the method I would have chosen. No, he agreed. It was not. The room fell silent. Finally, he spoke again. I am asking whether you will allow me the chance to know you properly. Charlotte considered his words carefully. You understand, she said, that I will not be grateful into anything. I would not want you to be, and I will disagree with you frequently. I expect it. She watched him for a long moment. Then she nodded. You may call again. Winter slowly passed. By early spring, Ashfield showed signs of recovery. The first payment under the new agreement was made successfully. Edward Fairley's health improved slightly as the weather warmed. One April afternoon, Julian asked Charlotte to walk with him along the southern field path. The narrow path led to an old stone bridge over a small river that marked the edge of the estate. They stopped there. The fields around them were turning green again after the long winter. Julian rested his hands on the bridge railing. I want to ask something honestly, he said. Charlotte waited. I cannot continue pretending that my interest in you is only neighborly. He paused. I am in love with you. The river moved quietly beneath the bridge. Charlotte turned to look out at him. I have known for some time what I feel, she said slowly. But I needed to be certain it was about you, not about what you had done for Ashfield. He nodded. And now? I am certain. He looked at her then, with a quiet expression she had never seen before. You understand, Charlotte added calmly, that I have conditions. A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. I expected that. Our marriage must be equal in practice, she said. My judgment must matter. My voice must be heard. Yes, and you must always tell me the truth. That, he said softly, has never been difficult with you. Charlotte looked across the spring fields. Then she answered simply, yes. They married that August in the small church at Ashfield Cross. The entire village attended. Thomas Bennet wept openly near the back of the church, Mrs. Doyle refused to cry, but later admitted privately that she had expected this outcome since November. Edward Fairley walked his daughter down the aisle with quiet pride. Charlotte wore her mother's pale gold wedding dress, and when she placed her hand in Julian Montgomery's, she felt something she had fought hard to protect through every challenge. Not victory, not relief, but something better. A life built on respect, courage, and truth. And in the years that followed, the people of the county often told the story of Charlotte Fairley. Not as a fairy tale, but as a reminder. That dignity is never weakness. That courage can change even the most powerful hearts. And that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk into a courtroom and refuse to be dismissed.